everyone, and welcome back to our MOA Live Talk series. It's Pride Month this June, so I thought it would be a good time to talk about queer archaeology. Before I get started, I'd just like to say again, thanks to anyone who is joining us. Also, if you are enjoying the series, please feel free to send us a donation. I will link that in the comments when I'm through here. And also, if there's at any point where there's something that's confusing, or you're not sure what I'm talking about, or you'd like elaboration, or if you just have a question, please do feel free to stop and leave a comment. I will see it on my screen and I can respond to it as we go. So, queer archaeology, what is it? So it's not necessarily archaeology that's done by queer people, or necessarily even looking for or investigating queer people in the archaeological record, but it's kind of a theoretical approach that guides the kinds of questions that we ask about the past and leads us to think critically about the conclusions we're drawing and where we may be introducing bias into our interpretations. So it's inherently about recognizing that while we like to create, we have this tendency to create like really clean categories, that people are and always have been much more complicated and messy than can be represented that way. And that there's always been people who fall outside whatever kind of binary system we're discussing and creating, and even projecting into our contemporary understandings of cultures, or into past cultures, and that this can create that this can create big misunderstandings. So the default lens for interpreting archaeology is really a heterosexual one. So we tend to think of family units, for example, of being heterosexually composed, and physical and social spaces being built around those default units or other binary systems like public and private, for example. So it's a default that often goes unchallenged, which can make it difficult to recognize alternative lifestyles or arrangements, or recognize when people are, in their own historical context, subverting the norms that we're trying to understand. And so this can confuse our interpretations and understandings of the past. So it also introduces that binary view of sexuality and gender, or introduces a binary view of sexuality and gender and other cultural constructions as well. So the term queer is an explicit choice because it's meant to reference anything that's in opposition or contrast to those norms, which can mean sexuality or gender, status, or any other ways of sort of knowing or being that can be incorporated into some person's identity. So queer theory challenges the assumptions we make based on what we hold as being normal or standard, and seeks to expose those biases so we can consider not only new interpretations, but new approaches to interpretation itself. So it's about restructuring our relationships of power, authority, and even truth. So in some ways, it's really less of a theory, and it's more a framework that supports this kind of questioning. It can be related to feminist archaeology as well, because this also supports a sort of questioning of really binary thinking, especially, again, in regards to sex and gender. So queer archaeology is not just about interpretation either. To some extent, it's actually about the practice of archaeology. So this questioning of what is normative, or what we take as the default or the normal right way to do things, can be applied to all kinds of questions we're asking, and even how we go about collecting evidence. So for example, recognizing that examining and classifying human remains based on perceived biological sex categories of male and female not only projects our scientific classification systems onto people of the past, but overlooks the flaws inherent in that scientific classification system as well. So how would you recognize somebody who's intersex and all the different ways it's possible for someone to be intersex, for example? And is anybody actually looking for this in a standard examination of human remains? And is this something that we're even teaching people how to do, let alone to think about? So, and that's not even taking into account how we project our biological, culture's biological conceptions of gender into the past either. So when we know that many societies, past and present, who've had completely different constructions. So queer archaeology is not just about recognizing this bias in the archaeological record and in archaeological practice, but it's also about recognizing it in the discipline. So for a long time, archaeology really was a province of cisgendered straight white men. And there's nothing wrong with being a straight cis white man, and there's many fine archaeologists who identify this way, but issues arise when this is the only perspective or even when it's just the dominant perspective from which the archaeological record is being approached, and the only voices that are contributing to the authority of the discipline. So in the past, and even in the present, though we like to think to a lesser extent, homophobia, transphobia have kept people with these queer identities, as well as other marginalized groups, from being able to practice archaeology. So it's kept these people with these different valuable perspectives out of the discipline at all, without able to contribute their voices. So this just reinforces the issues in the interpretations, because when your perspective is the default normal one, it's harder to think outside that box if there's no one around to challenge you. So criticism of queer archaeology can get pretty circular also, saying that having a queer perspective, or equating having a queer perspective with being biased, without recognizing that the same is true for having a more normative perspective. So, it's something that helps you think differently and helps you think of different kinds of questions than you might otherwise, and that's useful. It's not a bad thing. Let's talk about some examples of what queer archaeology actually looks like. So some of these deal with tackling queer identities in archaeology, but some of them take the approach that's sort of broader or just go in different directions when you're considering what it means to sort of queer this narrative, to question our biases and implicit assumptions. So, following on from my last week's talk on monuments and destruction of them and archaeology, let's go back to ancient Egypt. So there's actually a couple of really cool queer archaeology examples from ancient Egypt, and they're both related to how we understand relationships and gender and also iconography. So the first is an example of the tomb of two men, and I am not fluent in ancient Egyptian, so I apologize if I'm messing up my pronunciations here, but they are Neokhnum and Khnumhotep, who were buried together. So for a long time, interpretations focused on them being buried together because they were very close friends, or maybe they were brothers, or maybe they were even twins. But one scholar looked a little bit more closely about how they were actually depicted and compared that to other tombs. And he noted that while there's depictions of them in this tomb context are unique for close relationships between men, we don't really see this elsewhere, it's actually using common iconographic representations that were depictions of husbands and wives who were being buried together at the time. So both of these men were actually married and had children with their wives, but the depiction of those relationships in the tomb is kind of perfunctory, and there are places where they were either explicitly, were either explicitly omitted, or they were actually removed from some of the images as well. And this is really to highlight the intimacy of the two men. And it shows the same kind of imagery, the same relationships between them as depicted for husbands and wives who were buried together in other tombs, including pretty intimate, like face-to-face embraces that we don't get in any other kinds of contexts. So the queer interpretation here is that these two men were in some kind of relationship where the best analogy is that they considered themselves to be married in the same way an Egyptian man might be married to an Egyptian woman. And this has been used a lot to talk about homosexuality in the past and to demonstrate that it does have a very deep historical existence. So another cool example from queer archaeology from ancient Egyptian studies again comes from my favorite pharaoh, Hatshepsut. So this is going to get a little complicated, and so I hope you will bear with me. The paper that I read was very highly theoretical, and so I'm going to try and get across some of these ideas in a way that hopefully everyone can understand in a relatively short format. So if you listen to my talk on archaeology and the destruction of monuments, you will have heard me talk about her a little bit already. But for anyone who missed that, Hatshepsut was a leader of ancient Egypt from 1478 to 1458 BC, for about 20 years. Specifically, she was the fifth pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, making her only the second female pharaoh ever to that point. About 20 years after her death, most of the statuary depicting her as pharaoh was systematically destroyed. So we know that for Egyptians, pharaoh really was a gendered title. It was something that belonged to really a male domain. And much of the imagery of Hatshepsut shows her in these male contexts, including wearing male clothing and the false beard that was associated with being pharaoh, as well as the headdress that was specific to being pharaoh. So there was actually even reliefs that showed her as a young boy with a penis and testicles. So what does this mean? Past scholars have talked about her as though she was cross-dressing, or that she was explicitly playing with gender in a way that we would interpret as being like gender bending. And they've used this to make suppositions about her own sexual identity. Like, was she actually a woman? Maybe she was intersex. We know that she didn't have any children with her husband. So maybe that was the case. They've also made suppositions about her gender identity, like how did she think about herself, and of course about her actual behavior as well, meaning that since she was dressed this way in these iconographic depictions, she must have dressed this way in real life, right? But this is all supposition, and there's not really anything to support these interpretations. All we have is the imagery, and as I noted before, a lot of it was actually broken. So the paper that I read on this, in the context of queer archaeology, was really interesting, and as I said, also really theoretically complex. But what it comes down to is that if we're looking at her behavior in terms of a woman depicting herself as a man, then we're really still projecting our own notions about what that binary division and its meaning is into the past. So we know that Egypt did have a binary gender division, but that it's not really based on the same understandings we have about what it means to be male and what it means to be female, or what it looks like to subvert those norms. So what we are really seeing here is a woman who's depicting herself as pharaoh. So it's not necessarily about her sex or gender. And there are still ways in which she does follow those norms that are associated with ancient Egyptian femininity. And in fact, most of the time when she's being presented in this male clothing, in this pharaonic regalia, her name is still using female forms. So when it's describing her, it's still giving her that female identity. So this is really about her using iconographic language, which had its own power, to assert herself into that position of authority, not only with people, but with the gods as well. And that's the context where we see these reliefs of her as a young boy. It's about her relationships with the gods and her place as pharaoh, again, which we know is sort of a male gendered authority figure. And so that's the context in which we're seeing her represented as male. So notably also is her relationship with her theoretical co-ruler, Thutmose III, who I think I said in my last talk was her son, but is actually her husband's son by a secondary wife. So he was technically supposed to inherit or become pharaoh, but he was very, very young when his father died. So she came into the position by being theoretically his co-ruler, and then really stepped into being the pharaoh herself. However, in the iconographic depictions, if she had been depicted as female, so if she had been taking on that position, it would have meant automatically having a position of less prominence anytime they were shown together. So, in fact, she's always shown with him, whenever they're shown together, as a pharaoh, in pharaonic dress, and in a more prominent iconographic position. So essentially, this is because it was easier to depict her as a man, or for her to have herself depicted as a man, than to rewrite the entire Egyptian iconographic language to acknowledge the possibility of a woman being more powerful than a man. So in order for her to claim that power, she had to divest herself in these contexts of femininity and claim these other embodiments of power, including the clothing that she's wearing and the iconography, said this word too many times. So including the clothing and the iconography, so the power that those objects and depictions themselves had, she needed to have those speak for her also, to divest herself of her femininity in these contexts. So in this context, what the queer perspective is letting us do is really question those relationships between power and gender in these representations and what we know about Hatshepsut, and to do this without falling back on interpretations about gender presentation, like cross-dressing, gender bending, the way that had been talked about in the past, that really only have a meaningful context in our own culture, and to recognize that that is a bias that has been brought to those previous interpretations of what's going on with her. Okay, so then if we take this back to the first example of Mayan and Knuotep, what it means is we really have to be careful about saying things like, aha, these guys were gay. Or, given the fact that they did have wives, although the relationships were given less importance in their tombs, and saying maybe that they were bisexual instead. Because what it means to be gay does have a lot of cultural baggage, including a sort of binary opposition to heterosexuality that isn't necessarily the case in ancient Egypt. So again, what we can say is that they had an extremely intimate relationship depicted in a way that's similar to the way that relationships between husbands and wives are depicted. And that this particular expression of them being buried together and the unique context of their tomb was still pretty queer. So I have one more example of these kinds of queer approaches to the distant past. So I hope you'll bear with me here. So this one is looking at questioning of implicit biases that don't actually relate to sex or gender at all. And so I thought it was important to talk about this aspect of queer archaeology as well, because as I said, it's sort of a theoretical framework for approaching these things that help us question biases that we're bringing to interpretation, and especially when those deal with sort of binary opposites that we've created to help explain things. So this is actually looking at queering Mayan social status in ancient Belize. So traditionally, Mayan society has been interpreted as composed of a binary made up of elites and commoners, with the latter being seen as sort of more of a homogenous group, sort of akin to modern peasants, with the view that they're sort of deeply steeped in tradition and in a communal culture. So they're really seen as pretty much being the same. If you're not an elite, you're a commoner, and all commoners are basically the same. So an archaeological investigation of commoner sites in Chan, Belize, took a queer perspective by challenging the notion of that binary between elites and commoners and the assumptions that were made about commoner culture in general. So Chan was an agrarian village. It was a pretty small potatoes place, all things considered, in the Mayan landscape of the time. And it was occupied from around AD 250 and then more intensively from around AD 600 to AD 900. What the archaeologists found was that there was actually significant differences between these commoner households that included everything from architecture to their use of space, to access to material culture acquired through long-distance trade, and even to expressions of group and religious affiliation. So not only were there differences between different household groups, but the households themselves changed significantly over time. And this time dimension was actually important because the older household groups had higher status in the community because they had been there so long, whereas newer groups had to do more work to demonstrate their value to the community more broadly. So in this particular context, the newer group did so by performance and association of public religious ritual activity. So basically, even though these commoners had sort of all been lumped together in sort of this preconceived category that was seen to be pretty homogenous, there was actually a lot of internal distinctions within these commoner households once someone thought to challenge their notion, or the notion of this homogeneity, and contrasting them only with those who were perceived as being elites. So we've looked at queer theory as sort of a broad approach, and we've seen how it can be used to question bias, especially bias that is brought into the archaeological work because of the dominant heteronormative binary view of culture that we mostly operate in today. Obviously, there are a lot of theorists who are sort of challenging this in our modern perceptions as well. But I do want to talk about the archaeology of queer places a little bit, and specifically like LGBTQIA, etc., archaeology as well. So I've talked about how archaeology on the whole is more about perspective than about time frame. So you can do archaeology on sites that are more recent, but at the same time there's a legal dimension to what qualifies a site for historic preservation. And that can directly impact our ability to protect modern queer history, right? So there are places that have deep history as queer spaces, like for example nightclubs with roots in the 20s and 30s. But a lot of these places where there has been a lot of vibrant queer culture in the last century even have been a lot more transient, and that's partly because of the pushback in our culture towards queer visibility. So in the USA, for example, the Stonewall Inn is one of the only queer places in the National Register of Historic Places that's protected because of that association with queer history. And in Canada, I couldn't find any. I mean, I didn't look super hard. They might be out there and I might have just missed it, but I did, a cursory search and there was nothing. If there is something out there that I'm missing that somebody else knows about, I would love to hear about it. Please leave a comment. So our ability to, or as archaeologists, to recognize places as having historical importance to the queer community hinges on those who are involved being familiar with queer history and thinking about and considering that perspective in the first place. So if it's not in our heads, we're not going to even think to look for it, right? So like with many marginalized perspectives, that doesn't come naturally to everyone. There's a lot of work being done also in gender archaeology, but a lot of that work, as insightful as it is often still grounded in sort of this heteronormative binary views, where a queer perspective can help provide ways to identify and subvert that bias and give us access to new interpretations and ways of approaching the past. So it's a sort of, again, it's about questioning those biases and identifying them and recognizing them, or where they impinge on archaeological work and where they are having an unconscious influence and interpretation into our understandings of the past. So thank you, everyone. I hope that was interesting. I hope it made sense to everyone also. And I hope that everyone has the best Pride Month that they can have, given the sort of state of the world as it is. And I will be joining you again on Thursday, talking a little bit more about some of the stuff that's being done here at the Lost in Site at the Museum of Ontario Archaeology. So thank you, and have a great afternoon.